define how we teach history and what we can teach in the classroom. And before I go any further, I want to address that term, critical race theory. It's the most ridiculous argument ever that's going on right now with regard to this. For one thing, I as an historian, I object to the term of theory. It's not theory. What we're talking about is fact. It's history. There's no theory involved in race or racism or white supremacy in American history. It's fact. And the failure to address it is why we continue to have to deal with this stuff. So anyhow, I started off back in February with a presentation I gave originally back in 2012. And it was back during the 150th anniversary celebrations or whatever they were of the Civil War. And I called it Confessions of a Civil War Historian. It's sort of a coming to grips story, but it's also how my job has evolved over the years as a teacher of American history, and particularly the Civil War era. And it starts out with, there's an old adage that most of us are familiar with, and we certainly use quite a bit in our public discourse, and that's that the winners write the history. And that's really not true. And it's certainly not true with regard to the Civil War, because beginning within weeks of the Confederate defeat, in an effort to come to grips with the failure, Southern writers, politicians, journalists, former Confederate officers began to craft what came to be known as the lost cause narrative. And it was an attempt to explain how a superior culture, a superior form of manhood could be defeated by this sort of mongrel horde from the industrialized wasteland of the North. Now, as lost cause implies, the Southern Confederacy never stood a chance. But that's really not true either, especially against the massive manpower and all the material advantages the United States brought to bear. But the Confederates actually did have a chance to win the war. They didn't. None of this, though, kept the apologists, again, including former generals, from crafting this really appealing version of the Confederate history and the Confederate effort that over time would become the popular interpretation of the Civil War. The problem is, much of it is untrue. Indeed, most of it is untrue. Among the major tenets of the lost cause narrative are the willful de-emphasis of slavery as the chief cause of secession, along with an idealized depiction of the antebellum South, where a unified white populace lived in harmony with happy, loyal slaves. It was a solid South, as they often referred to it, where Southern women unfailingly supported the war in an effort to uphold Southern culture and the lifestyle that they cherished. The Southern soldier was absolutely devoted to the cause. He was heroic and saintly, clearly superior to his Yankee counterparts. And Confederate leaders, especially men like Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson and the most saintly of all, Robert E. Lee, were vastly superior to the generals of the United States. Finally, the Lost Cause holds that the United States won the Civil War not by talent, determination, and sacrifice, but simply because of overwhelming advantages in manpower and resources. For a number of reasons, not the least of which was reconciliation, the Lost Cause narrative gained traction and became the generally accepted interpretation of the war, as I mentioned. Despite the objections of United States veterans, African Americans, including leaders such as Frederick Douglass. And by the 1920s, the Lost Cause was so embedded and its message and imagery so pervasive that it held sway in popular culture, thanks to films like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, which was also a book, of course. Now, one of the things that happened since that February talk I gave is I taught a class on this. This summer, I taught a class built around the Lost Cause narrative to a group of students in our Governor's School for the Humanities. And it was a really cool experience for me. And I think for the students as well. We watched some of the films. And if you haven't watched The Birth of a Nation, the 1915 silent film, it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. We also watched Gone with the Wind in its entirety. And the stereotypes and the complete devotion to the whole Lost Cause narrative and depiction of the South is straight out of fairy tale land. And so it's all been really an interesting journey for me. But the bottom line is, though, it won. The Lost Cause narrative won. And it found its way into popular 21st century historical treatments of the Civil War. Writings by historians, respected historians, Pulitzer Prize winning historians, Bruce Catton, Douglas Southall Freeman, and others. For Catton, at least, the Lost Cause served to placate an avenged South and to somehow temper a vengeful North. This is a quote from him. And Catton was the preeminent Civil War scholar. He was not an academically trained scholar, but he was widely regarded as the authority on the Civil War in the 1950s and 60s. Here's this quote. "This was the Lost Cause, something to be cherished, to be revered, to be the outlet for emotions, but not to be the center of a new outbreak of violence. In that sense, I think the legend of the Lost Cause has served the entire country well." Okay, so here's an authority saying that a false narrative served the country well. What he meant was it made everybody feel good. And therein lies the problem. So we see events of the Civil War through this veil, as he put it. And he went on, we have elevated the entire conflict to a realm where it is no longer explosive. And I disagree with that. Quoting Catton again, "It is part of American legend, part of American history, a part, if you will, of American romance." That's all disturbing, right? And therein again is the problem. The problem, though, is that the acceptance of the Lost Cause interpretation didn't serve the entire country well. It dishonored the 2 million men who served the United States. It allowed the country to look away as white Southerners systematically disenfranchised the Black population while reasserting white supremacy. And for everyone, it proved detrimental to a comprehensive understanding of the war that was much more complex and complicated than the simplistic legend would allow. Its effects are, as mentioned, pervasive, and they are enduring. They're not going away. To a large extent, the romanticized, lost cause inspired understanding of the Civil War remains widely accepted today. It's reinforced to a degree by the writing of immensely popular authors like Shelby Foote, the fiction of guys like Michael Shara, who wrote a very important novel called Killer Angels about the Battle of Gettysburg that really resonated with the public. It's also steeped in lost cause myth. That also spawned a film, Gettysburg, with Jeff Daniels and Martin Sheen, among others. Terribly flawed movie, but again, dripping in lost cause narrative. Along with the lost cause interpretation is another factor that's hampered the understanding of the Civil War, and it's what I call the military vacuum. This is what I fell into as a kid. And this is the tendency to view the Civil War in strictly military terms. It's an attractive approach because it allows Civil War enthusiasts to divorce themselves from the sticky topics of slavery, economics, nativism. It's again, it's how I used to justify my interest in the war. I absorbed all this stuff as a kid. But the more I learned, the more I came to understand that you can't separate the military events from the political or cultural influences that drove them. You can't teach the Civil War without teaching slavery. And you can't understand American history without understanding race, and racism, and white supremacy. Or in understanding that there's not a single version of history. And that's really what's troubling nowadays is we have legislative bodies who are trying to tell us that there is a single version of history and that we have to stick to it, that we can't touch on uncomfortable stuff. We can't make students feel uncomfortable in class by discussing race or the uncomfortable truths of the past. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up buying into all this, and it led me to my current profession. I also grew up in Texas, and Texas is going through the same thing we're going through. Their state legislature is attempting to protect its cherished creation myth, the fictionalized history of the so-called Texas Revolution or the Texas War for Independence. Much like the lost cause narrative does to Civil War history and to particularly Southern history, the Texas creation story neglects the racism and the underpinnings of what was an attempt to expand slavery and white supremacy into an area that was at one time very thinly populated and what population existed there was either native or Hispanic. And what happened to the native population in the area that became Texas is largely washed away in this story of the Alamo and Davy Crockett and Sam Houston and all the valor of the defenders of the Alamo, and all of that stuff has pretty much been debunked by professional historians who have done the research. And so we have this battle really now between academic history and really fairy tale, to be honest. Because we know, thanks to research, we know the truth. It's all there. The Civil War was about slavery. Bottom line, most of American history to that point in history was about slavery. Everything about American history was in some way, shape, or form touched by slavery, whether it was the generation of massive wealth through forced enslaved labor, or whether it was through the political compromises that the country made in order to at first gain independence and then to maintain the status quo. At every opportunity that this new nation had to confront slavery, it punted. This wasn't a Southern thing, folks. It was an everybody thing. It was a national thing. But it was also very much a white supremacist or a racial superiority thing. And failing to confront that allows us to keep making the same mistakes. So 150 years plus after the events, we have to move away from romanticized notions and the glorification of such a destructive conflict as the Civil War. We need to explore the causes and effects. We need to ask questions. And that's one of the things that's so frustrating for me and for others who work in the field of history is it's so frustrating because so many people don't want to explore. They don't want to question. They don't want to confront reality. They want to be told something pleasing, something comforting. They don't want to be told that they're part of a national history that involved brutality. But you know, if we don't talk about that, what does that do? It allows us to sanction its continuation, doesn't it? We've seen that. We've seen it boldly displayed this year. There is no coincidence that the events of January the 6th involved a whole lot of Confederate flags and a whole lot of people talking about their history. And that gets us to the idea of these monuments and other Confederate symbols. I want to read a quote though before I move on, and I'll tie it up here shortly. And this is a quote from Professor David Blight of Yale, who's one of the leading historians on race in this country. His book, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory is a really important book. This is a long quote, but it's a good one. And here it is. This is quote, "This is a story of how in American culture, romance triumphed over reality. Sentimental remembrance won over ideological memory. For Americans broadly, the Civil War has been a defining event upon which we have often imposed unity and continuity. As a culture, we have often preferred its music and pathos to its enduring challenges, the theme of reconciled conflict to resurgent, unresolved legacies. The greatest enthusiasts for Civil War history and memory often displace complicated consequences by endlessly focusing on the contest itself. We sometimes lift ourselves out of historical time above the details and render the war safe in some kind of a national Passover offering as we view photographs of the blue and gray veterans shaking hands across the stone wall at Gettysburg. Deeply embedded in an American mythology of mission and serving as a motherlode of nostalgia for anti-modernists and military history buffs, the Civil War remains very difficult to shuck from its shell of sentimentalism. Over time, Americans have needed deflections from the deeper meanings of the Civil War. The believers in the, that's an end quote, the believers in the popular lost cause infused interpretation of the war often attack what they call revisionist history. I hate that term. And there's a popular podcast out there by Malcolm Gladwell, I think, called Revisionist History. And it's really not revisionist, it's forgotten history, or it's untold history. There is no such thing as revisionist history because history is an evolving thing. We learn new stuff every day. There is not a set narrative. There is not a stagnant, static, single version. History is different things to different people. As I tell my classes when I teach when I teach the US history classes or my upper level classes, I always say that history is our cultural DNA. And it's different for everybody, depending on how you grew up, where you grew up, if you grew up in the South or in the North, if you grew up male or if you're a man or a woman, if you're black or you're white or you're an immigrant, if you're rich or you're poor, if you're Christian or not. Your history, the way you view history is going to be different. And that's okay. This idea that we have to package it and believe in a single version is really, really dangerous. But it's also, again, it's exclusionary. And that's why we have to fight this. As citizens, we can't allow politicians to decide what we teach in the classroom, because we'll just keep getting what we're getting, which is an attempt to, well, it's brainwashing. And that's really what politicians use history for, is to manipulate the public and to keep us compliant. Why do we celebrate war so much? Why do we have like reenactments? Well, this film I'm going to show you in September is it has some really fun stuff and some awfully disturbing stuff as well. So anyhow, the bottom line for me is that this lost cause is just it's just one way to look at a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is what I've said about the lost cause can really be said about the prevailing narrative that is United States history, about the founding fathers, about the myths of the Declaration of Independence. You know, a lot of Americans believe that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. It's all neat. All men are created equal. You know, the idea of American exceptionalism. Students are always shocked when I talk about American imperialism. Oh, we don't do that. The United States isn't an empire. Oh yeah. Anyhow, it's gotten a lot bigger. The story's gotten a lot bigger since February, and it's going to get bigger still as one element of our society continues to cling to the idea of this protecting a sanitized, whitewashed, literally whitewashed version of history. One of the people I've started reading since February is this guy named Lucian Truscott the Fourth. I don't know if any of you have read any of his stuff. He's a fourth generation Army officer. His father was a three-star general in World War II, fought in Italy and Europe. But now he's a leading voice in the opposition to this sort of sanitized version of history. And he wrote a nice piece in which he talked about that. He said the people these politicians who are trying to restrict how we teach are they just want to feel good about it. They're using history to feel good when the opposite should be true. History should make us uncomfortable. It should make us confront our past transgressions and help us move in a better direction. The idea that history repeats itself is not legitimate. History does not, by definition, repeat itself. That would be physically impossible, unless there's some sort of a supernatural thing going on there. What history does, though, is we fail to learn from it. And so humans repeat mistakes or repeat past behaviors that have proven destructive. That's why failing to learn from our history, failing to learn from the Civil War in this case, has prevented us from having a better understanding of the country that we are, the people that we are, and it's prevented us from moving forward in a constructive way with regard to race, particularly, but discrimination, imposing of a social order, all of those things have been facilitated by the embrace of the lost cause narrative and the overall American history that we've come to accept. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more dirty than anyone would really like to know. But it really helps the more you understand the history, all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the better citizen you become. And that's what I try to tell my students. Anyhow, Mrs. Washington, would you like me to stop here or is there anything?
Well, it's not that I want you to stop because I could listen and learn for hours, but we would like to acknowledge some items in the chat. Rich says, it's hard not to see parallels to the 1920s with MAGA as the new 100 Americanism. Same goes for the legislated assault on teaching science and history. And Eric shared with us the author, Truscott. There is a link there. Eric says he's not encouraging the use of Amazon, but that is an Amazon link there. So what we'd like to do now, and thank you, Dr. Coffey. I may have to check into some of your classes. I'm old enough now that I can monitor. So I may have to check some of those history classes. But what we'd like to do now would be break out into small groups. I'll stop the recording. Where do I do that? Oh, up here.
Garlett's had, but he also mentioned before he left, just to Ryan and I, that his observations of teaching history in the university setting is quite different than how people view and teach history in K-12. So his observation is that, which also has a lot to do with the CR, critical race theory in schools, which I use air quotes on purpose, but K-12 education is more like civic nationalism versus where in university it's more critical. Like you actually learn many sides of history rather than just civic nationalism. So that was his point. He wanted me to share with the group. But
yeah, that's a really good point, because I think I mentioned this back in February that as going through school, there's so much of this stuff I didn't even get. I didn't go to school with a black student, I think 7th grade. I went, we'd never talked about slavery. We never talked about civil rights in class. It was all that civic nationalism thing. It's really what it was. And for me, war, and this is taking us in a different direction, but one of the things that really gets me is when I meet somebody and I say, "Oh, I love history." I want to come back and say, "What do you love about it? What's there to love?" Because it's not history they love, it's the story. Yeah. So, and it's often, one of these romanticized stories.
His story.
Very good, Henry.
Exactly.
His story.
Yeah, we don't get a whole lot of women voices in our K through 12 school lessons either. You might get a little Harriet Tubman or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or something, but not many.
And so you learn that civil nationalism all through school, and then you do like I did, good evangelical Christian girl who was taught this nationalistic history throughout all of my school. I get to college and I get a teacher who teaches the critical truth, like David or Ricky. And I sit there in my classroom with my arms like this, just kind of going, oh, this is the exact liberal brainwashing that my church warned me about. But that's not it. It took me years to get to finally realize, no, Heidi, they were just teaching you the truth. They were just teaching you real history. But because you've spent 12 years in a school system where you get that thing that Ricky was talking about, when you get to college and you get these teachers, that's why we end up with these students who seem to be so resistant to what they're hearing.
One of the things that I've discovered is you really can't hammer this stuff into students. Your message has to be nuanced, or you lose them. I mean, if I just went in there and said everything you've learned about your history, your past is wrong, and I'm gonna tell you how it really was, you lose them right then. So you have to first create an environment of trust and respect, and then slowly, carefully change the narrative, or just inform. Like one of the things I do is I'll tell a class that you're not going to have, those of you who think history is about names and dates, forget that. I might ask you to know 2 or 3 dates in this entire class. One of them is going to be 1619. That's the date you have to remember. Another one's going to be 1890, and I won't explain that here, but eras, not days, not, you know, there are very few days, but the important thing is context. And with regard to slavery and race, you just, I think, have to be honest. And one for a white male, for a 60-year-old white male, I mean, I'm not exactly in the liberal demographic, but thanks to growing up in a liberal household, an educated household, and with the influence of a Black woman who basically raised me as a child, I was privileged, and privileged beyond my white skin and my social stature. I was privileged to have that exposure. And so it's just something I just try to be honest when I teach, and I try to make it not about pounding something into somebody's head, but bringing them along as we go.
Wow, I can't wait for the video next month, because the whole discussion thus far has been enlightening and lively. So what we would like to do in the next couple of minutes is to see if any of the breakout groups would like to share what your discussions were about. And keep in mind that next September, Carol made me a lovely
11th.
slide. Thank you. September the 11th at 10 o'clock, we will have the video, and we can continue this conversation in case some of you have to drop off. So which work group would like to, breakout group would like to go first? Well, how about work group 1? Or breakout group 1? Cassie, you're muted.
There we are. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We had talked about how what we were taught in school was very sanitized, and we talked about how important it was to have these conversations where we talk privately about things that happened. And And Nancy Hines, her husband, he talked about how it's like being in a doctor's appointment or a psych appointment, where until America talks about the uncomfortable stuff that has happened in our past, that we can't heal. And then we also talked about how critical race theory is being used as a diversion from that. So
Thank you, Cassie. Is there another group? What about group 2? If you were in group 2.
I think Ann Gathers will share for us.
She seems surprised. Anne?
Brother Randy, I did not volunteer as the appointed speaker. Brother Randy had mentioned when he visited Oklahoma City, he had visited the Cowboy Museum and how much of the lifestyle of cowboys was glorified there and romanticized. So that kind of answers that second question of other examples of a romance winning over reality. But he also talked about how there was some history that was presented to him that surprised him, and that was that the Hispanic cowboys had brought, or Hispanics, maybe I'm not speaking correctly how Hispanic cowboys, but Hispanics had brought African slaves into this country earlier than he had realized. Slaves were brought into the country, and the fact that they were brought in by the Hispanics. So that was something new that he had realized in history, and talked about history was, as Dr. Coffey said, it's not repeating itself, it's always changing, or new things are always being revealed as we learn through history. And then I just asked Dr. Coffey how he advises us and others, including his students, to discern credible sources of history. And we talked about that, but one of the things that he talked about is make sure you look and see who's writing it and determine if there's a political agenda or some other type of motivation or agenda behind it. And also primary sources are good ones to go to look at the actual writings and the dialogue of others. So we talked about that. And on internet.com and usually .edu sources are maybe more credible. So we diverged a little bit on the sources of credibility. Did I get that, Brother Randy?
Thank you. And group 3. Group 3.
Well, we talked about how we hated history in high school because it seemed like a box of facts that you're supposed to memorize, like times tables. And most of the facts were about wars and kings and presidents. And we didn't know that there were a whole lot of stories that were left out until we got to grad school, really.
Caroline and I didn't really participate in our group. We kind of caught in at the end. We jumped in at the end there after talking with Ricky. But after speaking with Ricky and then hearing from Heidi a little bit ago about the way history is taught in K through 12 versus the way history is taught at the college level, I realized that in college, I never had that moment where I thought that the way it was being taught had changed at all.
Yeah.
And I did take some history colleges in college. I mean, I didn't like major in history or anything, but I don't remember ever having a realization that the way it was being taught, had changed. But I definitely agree with it now. So I guess it's something that's just kind of seeped into my conscience over time. But I never had that moment that Heidi was talking about or that Ricky was talking about. And correct me if I'm wrong, Caroline, but I think Ricky said that it was once he became a professor that it really occurred to him.
After years, several years of teaching, not his first year, but after several years of cycling through students.
I can tell you, I teach a whole lot differently today than I did 10 years ago and 20 years ago, and a whole lot more differently than I did when I first started teaching at the college level back in the 90s. So that's, I get exactly what Ryan's saying there. It's, I think we've evolved as a profession, and we've become more inclusive in the classroom, and for some of us that's required some big retrofitting. For others it's come more naturally, but the newer generations of historians are much more diverse and much more exposed to new topics and different perspectives. So I think there's a lot of room for growth still, but we have a big job ahead of us. And those of us who teach, I think anything, it doesn't have to be history. Anytime we're in front of students is an opportunity to enlighten, and we have to take advantage of that.
I think that's one of the reasons that I get some resistance when I teach, because a lot of times I'm introducing students to information that they've never had before, they've never heard before. They have been indoctrinated with some of the same information that we've been talking about. And so for many of them, they resist that. For a lot of them, they have never had a Black instructor ever in grade school, high school. And so it's shocking for many of them just to even see me. And then when I start introducing information to them about racism, about how it intersects with so many other areas in our lives, many of them don't want to hear that. Some of them are very interested because they've never even thought about it before. And so it makes them want to learn more. But David, I think you're absolutely right. We have a great charge before us to bring this information to our students, to young people, because for many of them, just like us, they've never heard it before.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages I have maybe in getting the opportunity to break through some barriers is the very fact that I am a white man from the South. So I can confront people, white
Right.
people,
Right.
perhaps a little easier than say my colleague Henry Parker, who tends to scare threatened white people because he's confrontational. I can say the same thing and not be as threatening.
Exactly.
So it's really instructive, and a good, but not always, a good case in point is and I'm not, if anybody's a KA in here, I'm not attacking, but the Kappa Alpha order has part of their mission statement basically a reverence for the Confederacy, and particularly Robert E. Lee. He's like the patron saint of the fraternity. And one year in class, I was critical of Lee. And man, you would have thought I had committed a crime. They thought I was attacking them because they had been told that this guy was a saint on earth and a great man. And he's responsible for killing more Americans than any other single American. Period. So sometimes even if you try to be nuanced, it's doesn't work, but it's worth a try, I guess.
I would like to offer in the time we have left that not only as teachers or professors, I think we each, as we walk our path, we have a responsibility to speak truth to power when it comes to racial justice, diversity, and inclusion. And as we said in group one or breakout one, it's like planting a seed. So don't think you're going to change anybody's mind. You just want to accept them where they are and offer a different perspective. And watch and have that be nurtured and watered. I believe in humans, and I think they eventually make the right decision. But it's about giving them the space and the time to be heard and to process. And that doesn't mean that I compromise my beliefs. So I would like to thank Dr. Coffey and all of you for joining us this morning. If you have to leave, know that we are grateful that you could join us. Heidi is going to share some announcements with you. Let me share my screen, Heidi. I have a slide for you. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. Heidi, you're muted.
Can I share the screen? Because I have.
Oh, you made a screen?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It'll
have
go
to make
faster that
you-
way if I can just show my screen.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Oops. Okay. Okay. So I have 2 slides, that's all. And so just our upcoming, for everybody to know, our upcoming WCRP events. This Thursday night, 6:30 to 8, we have our book group. And if you want to join in, you can email weeklyreconciliation@gmail.com, and we will let you have the book link, the Zoom link for our book group this Thursday. Wednesday, September 8th, we will have a table at the Soybean Festival's Community Night Health, and that will be the health time. That's from 5 to 7. If any of you would be willing to volunteer to sit at the table for those 2 hours, any time period for 30 minutes to an hour, anything that you can spare, please email us at Weekly Reconciliation to volunteer. We would love to have more people help out and be a part of that. Saturday, September 11th, as you know, David Coffey will be showing his video. And we have decided that we will be holding our meetings every second Saturday of the month. We will have one more meeting after September, and that will be October 9th. We don't know a speaker yet, but you can put that on your calendars. And we wanted to let everybody know we still are planning, if we ever get past our pandemic, we still are planning to make the trip to Montgomery to visit the Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum. We hope to do that hopefully in the late spring or maybe the fall of 2022, and we will provide information as information becomes available. But we have not given up on that yet. And then finally, ways for people to get more involved in WCRP. You can donate to us. You can go to our website, www.weeklyreconciliation.com. Click on donate, and you can donate to our organization, or better yet, you can join a committee. We would love to have more help on the outreach committee. We also have a history committee that's looking into the race and justice in our county. We also have a faith and community committee, which seeks to promote racial awareness and reconciliation as the foundation of faith practice. So if you would love to get more involved with Weekly County Reconciliation Project, again, you can email us at the same address, weeklyreconciliation@gmail.com, and you can get more involved in one of our committees. And so those are my announcements.